climate change is being used now as the excuse for everything that's happening in California, it seems like, and the wildfires is an easy target. I'm from California. I have an agricultural background, grew up on a farm in Northern California and ranched also in the foothills range up in Northern California. And my experience of how the land was managed back in those days is vastly different than what we have today. And you've just described some of that problem that we have. Environmentalists who have gotten a hold of the argument and the narrative for all these decades have been absolutely wrong. They have taken the polar opposite policy of what would have been smart for conservation of the land. And they never admitted that they were wrong, but these are the same people that have been crying about climate change, global warming for all these years, same people. So of course, nothing they do can be wrong. It has to have some other excuse. And so, yeah, they say, well, it's climate change. There's no proof of that. Climate change never started a fire. That's ridiculous. Matches and lightning and stuff like that start fires, but climate change doesn't start fires. And then they say, well, it's because the trees are so hot because we have 110-degree days. We had 110-degree days back when I was a kid, for Pete's sake. We didn't like them at all, but we did. And they didn't last very long necessarily. But
one thing they'll say is they'll point to the drought,
yes,
and then suggest that the drought happened because of climate change.
Yes. It almost becomes kind of a circular reasoning thing in my mind. When one thing falls apart, when one idea falls apart, they come up with another one, but they eventually circle back to the original thing they started with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, since when does a couple extra degrees of temperature result in a drought? I mean, in South Florida, it's a lot hotter than it is in California, and they got a ton of rain there. So I have a feeling that temperature and precipitation are not directly related based simply on comparing Miami to Los Angeles.
That's exactly right. The weather in California, by the way, this has nothing to do with technocracy per se. I just happen to have lived there and I know this. The weather in California is not generated from California. It comes from the ocean. The ocean is the primary determinant of California weather. And anybody who's watched the weather forecast very long knows the very first thing they put up on the TV is what's coming in from the Pacific Ocean.
Right. Well, the ocean is warming. So does the warming of the ocean cause a drought?
That's what some people will say. But, we also know that there's all kinds of things that happen in the ocean. You've had El Nino, La Nina, and all kinds of other phenomena that they've talked about over time. These things happen.
Yeah. Well, and not to mention our drought actually ended 2 years ago. We had a fairly dry summer this summer, but we're not technically in drought. We've had tons of rain the past couple of years, and we're still getting the wildfires.
Yep. That's right. It just doesn't hold water. And the mismanagement of the forest is just epic. I have never seen anything like this before. You'd want to say it's criminal in a sense, because if you kind of love the forest and you love, nature in general, I can imagine your heart might have sunk when you went to Yosemite. Mine would. I haven't been there for a long time, but if I saw that, I would just be really depressed. And I'd get mad after that. I say, what's wrong with you people? All this stuff should be cleared out. There should be basically nothing on the forest floor that would kindle and spark a fire. But I will hasten to say there's been another factor from year to year that has really exacerbated the fires in California. And I've actually talked to some forest, the PhD types in forestry who have verified this with me, that have been testing the treetops of the trees in the forest. In other words, that top 10% of the flora. And they've discovered that there is a heavy concentration of certain elements that normally are not found on the top of trees, much of which happens to be flammable, or at least it catalyzes in flame. And they attribute that. Of course, it changes from year to year because you get new growth at the top of a tree. So what's there this year probably won't be in the same concentration next year. But this whole concept of geoengineering has really exacerbated, and sometimes, maybe not right now, but sometimes, the fires that take place, because it allows the fires on the ground to turn into what are called crown fires, where the crowns of the trees at the very top pick up their own life and their own fire, create their own weather pattern, and then start blowing this across the top of the trees. This is what happened in Paradise last year. The fire went over the city and all of a sudden started raining down fire all at the same time on the whole city. I've never seen anything like this. I had a good friend who was a fire captain up in Paradise, retired now, but he knew the area like the back of his hand. He'd serviced it for a year, like 15 years or something. And he said he's never seen anything quite like that either, where a crown fire just went whoosh with the wind, and all of a sudden everything was normal. 1 minute you look up and you say, wow, look what's going on, kind of weird going on up there in the trees. And then all of a sudden fire just starts raining down from the tops of the trees and burns everything up in the ground.
What is the geoengineering you're referring to?
Well, geoengineering is the spraying of chemicals into the atmosphere, ostensibly to stop, the Earth from warming. This was kind of an experimental program for a time. I haven't seen any of these so-called spray planes, maybe a couple this year, but not very many. But 2 years ago, it was just absolutely, our skies were just crisscrossed with these, what some people call chemtrails, but they're emissions that are purposely generated from jet airplanes at high altitude to cover the Earth, to cause a haze so that the Earth will not, heat up as much. That was their idea. It never really turned out well. It's just one more cockeyed program that the environmentalists, cooked up, trying to do something that they should just keep their hands out of in the first place, like they should have kept their hands out of forest management and all the other environmental catastrophes we've had in California.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the past week, we've had enough emissions from these wildfires to account for a full year of auto emissions.
Oh, yes.
So all these billions that California has been spending to reduce carbon emissions to save the planet just went up in smoke, literally, with these fires.
Yeah.
And the absurdity that California thinks that it can somehow solve the world's global warming problem by itself when it is a speck on a globe.
Yes.
And it's independently taxing its people billions of dollars. And this is a tax. When I say a tax, it's, our energy costs are obviously far, far higher than other states because we have to get our energy from solar, et cetera, and wind. And this is a tax primarily on California's poor, because wealthy people, this is nothing to them. To have your energy cost double is nothing to a wealthy person. But to the poor, it means the difference between having something a little extra in the bank at the end of the month and not having it. So California has been taxing its poor to solve the world's climate change problem.
Yes. And that'll never happen. And California gets a lot of weather and a lot of input, even from Asia, as well as just from the normal ocean circulation. But you remember when the big earthquake and tsunami hit Fukushima, the radiation that resulted from that nuclear catastrophe in Japan wasn't too long before they were measuring radiation on the Pacific coast, and it was measurable radiation. And so we see there is a connection between the continents as well as the ocean, and a lot of stuff that happens in China eventually will make its way towards, and kind of change and morph with other things, but it'll make its way towards California. So California is not an island unto itself.
No, in fact, I'll give you an even more specific example. I don't have the numbers with me, but it was a respected publication, I forget which one it was, that said that X% of pollution in California comes from China.
Yes.
A very significant percentage
of
our pollution comes from China. So despite the fact that we might be doing whatever we're doing to bring it down, whatever China's doing is bringing it up. Hence, what I've always said is hey, it makes sense if California wants to do something with global warming, enter into a pact, at least some type of international pact where others are doing the same thing. Just don't independently do it.
That's right. And then subsequently punish all Californians for for the rest of the world's sins.
Yeah. And then screw it all up when you allow these crazy wildfires.
I know.
So what is the connection between the international climate change movement and the international response to COVID?
That's a great question. I think more people are finally catching on to this. Way back when this first thing started, and well, it started probably in February, it really got big here in the US. In April, or actually late March, I wrote the first article in my series that that documented the fact that the same climate change crowd that has been pandering to fear mongering over climate change, like climate extinction and Greta Thunberg with the youth movement and that sort of thing.
And some real radicals, taking to the streets.
These people are unplugged from reality, in my opinion. But they're many of them were from Europe. The people in America were not necessarily quite as causative as they were in Europe and especially in Great Britain. But the first study that came out about the pandemic that said that America is going to lose 1.2 million people and Great Britain was going to lose 500,000 people, that's what started the panic. And that study came out written by a professor, Neil Ferguson, at Imperial College of London, which happens to be one of those sustainable development universities. It's action-oriented, it's social impact-oriented, not educationally oriented. These are the same people that created the computer models for climate change that said we're all going to die in 12 years. And so what I saw in that right away was I knew their computer models were already whacked because that's what you have at Imperial College. And the epidemiologist that wrote that first program made these predictions. Within a few months, his whole computer model was completely trashed by the international community. They said, this is nothing that should be used for prime time, and it is absolutely inaccurate. Lousy programming, in other words. So the guy's a lousy programmer, he's a lousy epidemiologist, but I will suggest that since he had very close ties with the United Nations and the climate change crowd, that he's part of that institution that's trying to, stampede the world into sustainable development. That's what this whole thing is about. The shutting down of the global economic system has been a goal of this technocracy movement for decades. And the only way that they could have possibly gotten the world to kill itself, suicide, is to pull something like this where they can cause a global pandemic, a global fear-mongering pandemic, to scare people into doing what they want them to do. They'll use other reasons to do it, but they want to scare people into doing the things. And so Neil Ferguson was the one that came up with the policy first for wearing face masks, as well as for social distancing. He was also the guy that put the policy out for closing all the schools down, the universities down to, K1, even preschool for that matter. And we've seen all these predictions or these forecasts and policies were taken throughout the world, mostly by the United Nations, which has treaties with all these various countries to do the things that the UN tells them to do, like with the World Health Organization. They're bound by treaty to follow the UN's lead. So when they took these studies from Imperial College around to the world, they said, you must do this, and you must do it now, and here's the policies you must follow, thus saith the UN. And the world, including the United Nations, thanks to Anthony Fauci and Dr. Birx, United States adopted these policies as well from top to bottom. And here we are today. But this is the same crowd that brought us the whole climate change, global warming, fear-mongering debacle. And they're now working the same scam using this fear-mongering program. Nothing has changed. It's just the catalyst has changed, but the goal has not changed.
So most people, it seems to me, think of this movement as being a global socialist movement, global communist movement. You call it a technocracy. What is a technocracy and how is that different?
Well, back in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, a group of scientists and engineers at Columbia University in New York City got together and decided that capitalism was going to die. They believed it was on its last legs. And of course, there was reason, I'm sure, to think that in the 30s. It was a pretty dark time. But they felt that they had the ability to create something from scratch, a new economic system altogether that would be based on resource management and controlled by energy consumption, distribution, and production. And so they created this system and they called it technocracy. It was an engineered economic system based on resources and energy. It failed during that period of time. They wanted to get rid of all politicians in the country. They wanted FDR to declare himself dictator, and so he could just implement technocracy and get rid of Senate, get rid of Congress, get rid of all the other politicians in the country, and just simply create an org chart and appoint these people to these top positions to manage the economy. They honestly did not see any need for a political system whatsoever. They felt that they could just dictate economic policy, and therefore all of society would be controlled, corralled, monitored, etc. And without going into any, a lot of detail and stuff, I'll fast forward into the 70s and the 80s when this entire doctrine of technocracy was fed to the United Nations under a new name called sustainable development. I've studied this in great detail. I dedicated a chapter in my latest book, Technocracy, The Hard Road to World Order, to demonstrating that technocracy and sustainable development are functionally equivalent, almost down to the last detail. But sustainable development proposes to manage all economic resources, and it proposed, of course, is all energy-centric as well, the carbon footprint, this, that, and the other. But their goal at the United Nations has been to destroy capitalism and free enterprise and replace it with sustainable development. They've been openly declaring this now for at least 5 years and kind of covertly in some of their documents for maybe 25 years. But nevertheless, the United Nations has made their declaration. They want to do away with the brown economy. That's the one we used to have, sustainable, that's the free enterprise type of economic system, free market economics. They want to get rid of all that, replace it with sustainable development.
Now, hold on. Let me ask you, is sustainable development about climate change? Is that the rationale behind sustainable development, is that we've got global warming and we need to control this?
Sorry, I lost you for a second there.
Yeah, is sustainable development about addressing climate change and global warming?
In order for sustainable development to come about, the people at the United Nations cooked up global warming as the scaremongering, the fear-mongering element to drive people into sustainable development. There's no way, and I think they knew this from the get-go, there was no way that the world was going to voluntarily walk into sustainable development. It made no sense. They don't want anything to do with property rights. They want to change everybody's diet. They want to, basically change everything that we have fun with, get away from all that. And they just want to micromanage everybody. Nobody's going to walk into that with their eyes wide open. So climate change has been used as the whip, if you will, or the cattle prod to stimulate people to go to sustainable development. And that's the only solution, by the way, that they ever have offered for any problem. You look at any literature, global warming literature, climate change literature, and you will see the only proposal to overcome climate change is to implement sustainable development. There's no plan B. That's the only thing they want. They don't want to remake or rework capitalism or free enterprise or whatever and correct some of the things there that need to be corrected, but they only promote sustainable development. That tells you something right there. That it's
so they're using alleged climate change as the basis or the reason why we need sustainable development. Are you saying that back in the 30s, they were basically using the Depression as the reason we needed technocracy, which is the same thing as sustainable development?
Well, the Depression certainly offered the, let's say, the seedbed for, the doctrine of technocracy to be put together. It wasn't the cause of it. In other words, somebody didn't say, oh, let's cause the Great Depression so we can get technocracy.
Right.
The Great Depression happened for a number of reasons. I'm sure it was ugly all around and very complicated, but the Great Depression happened outside of their control.
Right.
When it did, these engineers and scientists said, we need to save the day.
Mm-hmm. Just like now they're saying we've got global warming, which exists to whatever extent, and they're saying we need to save the day with the same thing.
That's just about it. I
right.
know. And
so put the best spin on this you can if you're an advocate for technocracy or sustainable development. Put that hat on, the opposite hat of yours,
wow.
and try to convince. I know it's hard, but can you just explain to us what they think is so good about what they're trying to do?
Well, the so-called Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17 of those that were created at the 2030 Agenda meeting that happened a few years ago, at which time, by the way, 197 nations of the world signed on to the 2030 Agenda, and that was how things are going to change between then and 2030. 2030 is coming up pretty soon now, I have to say. So those 17 Sustainable Development Goals start out with this goal. Number one, this is what they lead with. Eliminate poverty in all its forms everywhere. Now, who can argue against that? We're going to eliminate poverty with our program. In other words, sustainable development will eliminate poverty. Everybody's got to cheer that kind of a goal. And then they go on and they say, everyone should have a job with dignity. Well, I want a job with dignity. I'm sure you do too. And, the list goes on for about the first 10 items that are Pollyannish, utopia-ish goals that anybody with two brain cells could figure out will never happen anyway. You're not going to eliminate poverty in the world. Never has been eliminated yet, and it won't be. And we've had a war on poverty ourselves, never got anywhere with it. So these Pollyannish goals are never going to be realized, but people buy into them. It's, this is the lost leader. It's, man, I'm all for, poverty. And if you're not, they will say to you things like, well, so you're for poor, you're for making people poor, aren't you? No, that's not what I mean. And you get in a circular argument with this, and you come back to in the end of it saying, oh, I really am for eliminating poverty. I don't want to see people suffer poverty, et cetera, and go hungry and whatever. So this is the picture that they paint, and then the bait and switch is found down in item number 16, 17, and a little bit up as well. That all you have to do in order to get those goals met is you have to give us control over all the resources of the world, of the whole planet, and we will manage those resources on your behalf in kind of a global common trust. And we'll take care of you. We'll make sure that we meter out what we think is right to your manufacturers and your business people and your vendors, et cetera, that they should be selling to individuals. And oh, by the way, the consumption economy basically needs to go away. And we will also tell you citizens of the world what you should be allowed to consume. This is dictating from both ends of the economic system. They'll tell business people what to make. They'll tell consumers what they're allowed to consume. And how much resources goes into it is in their hands. See, this is not freedom. This is slavery. But they can't come out and lead with that. They lead with the utopia.
How much the Paris Climate Accords, if I got the name right,
yes,
is that right in line with this? Did that have the same similar 17 type goals?
Well, not exactly, but I will say, and I bring this out actually in a couple of chapters in my latest book. The United Nations created a troika of conferences, global conferences, where they were coordinating three different threads, if you will, or three different initiatives that all dovetailed into each other. And the idea was this. First, they had the Paris Climate Accord. And that was primarily about global warming and setting targets for carbon emissions and so on. But right on the heels of that, there were two other conferences that took place that were just as important, just as big, where all the nations of the world came at the same time. One was called the New Urban Agenda, and that set the standard for cities and how cities would be managed in the world. And then there was the 2030 Agenda, which kind of updated Agenda 21 from 1992 and created the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But what I found out in my research is these three different conferences were all very carefully coordinated in terms of the effect that it would have on the nations who signed the three treaties. And even those who did not see what was coming when they signed the climate accord, Paris Climate Accord, they may not have seen what was coming. But when it did, they were almost compelled to continue signing the documents. And when the third conference took place, the 2030 Agenda, everything then was snapped into place for a lot of what we're seeing today.
So this does sound like Marxism to me. Is this just international Marxism? I guess Marxism inherently is international, but isn't that what this is?
Well, a lot of people look at it and conclude that. And, you know, without making a huge argument against it, I don't believe that is the case. I believe that technocracy is an independent element. I studied this with quite a bit of research back to the 1930s. And what I found out back then was that Communist Party was really big in the 1930s. Communists and technocrats hated each other's guts. If they knew, you know, if they saw somebody across the street that they knew was a communist, they might well go and get in a fist fight. But they constantly wrote articles in newspapers, I read several of them, where they took pot shots at each other for various reasons. But the technocrats hated the communists for this reason. The communists still accepted and used a price-based economic system. This was where they choked. This is where the technocrats choked on communism. The technocrats proposed an energy-based economic system where you control the economy through energy. The rest of the world today, and through all the Marxist countries in the world today, continue to operate with a price-based economic system. That is some measure of supply and demand. So this rift between communism and technocracy has existed for a very long time. And having said that, the Marxist elements in the world today, I believe, have inadvertently become the useful idiots for this column of technocrats who are trying to control everything right now. Control by algorithm, control by automation, control by science. This is an economic system, not a political system. Marxism, socialism, and communism were political systems, even though they had a lot to say about the economy. Technocracy is not interested in political systems per se. It's only interested in economic control.
But isn't the net effect of Marxism versus technocracy somewhat the same, which is effectively a redistribution of wealth?
It is not just a redistribution. There is no, it's a grab for the whole pie. They're not going to redistribute anything but crumbs to people if they ever get into power and control over all the resources of the world. You're not going to see the light of day on it for the rest of your life. Here's a good example. Down in the Gulf of Mexico, let's say you had $10 million in your pocket and you're thinking, what can I do to make 10 million more? And you thought, I know an oil engineer who knows where there's an oil well or a gas well in the Gulf of Mexico, and I'm going to go to the government of the United States and I'm going to secure myself a lease to go out and lease that ground and drill a well with my $10 million, and I'm going to make a bunch of money pumping gas and selling it to whoever, right? Now, so you go to the government and you say, "Hi, my name's Joe Schmo, and I'm here to get a lease for. I got money. I'm going to go down and drill myself a well." They're going to look at you and they're going to laugh you right out of the room before they chase you out of the room. You're not the kind of people we lease land to in the Gulf of Mexico, dude. We don't know who you are, and we don't know where you got your money. We don't care. You're not Exxon. You're not BP. You're not part of that global clique that has the whole permission to drill oil and gas in the world. Get out of here. You're not going to see those resources ever in your own name. And this is what they've been doing throughout the world as the United Nations has gone around and established these wilderness areas, these heritage zones in the world where nobody can go in and take the resources out of those areas. We've got these kinds of areas throughout the United States right now. And as you know, in the West, in a couple of states now, almost 75% of the landmass is owned by the federal government. You'll never see that land again because they don't sell it. Once they gobble it up, it just like vanishes into thin air as far as you're concerned. You can look at it, you can fly over it, but you'll never enjoy the economic benefit from it.
So who's really behind this movement, and what is their end goals? Are they truly trying to do something what they genuinely in their hearts believe is going to be great for the world, or is this something more selfish where it's really designed to benefit them?
Man always has selfish motives for everything he does. I have to admit that, and we all know that's true. There definitely is a profit motive. People want to get theirs, so to speak, with whatever they're doing. But the technocrat mind is, in my opinion, very disassociated with reality. They have their own reality. Part of that reality is that nobody else can discover truth about the universe except them using their so-called scientific, their scientific method. It's not truly the scientific method that you might have learned in high school chemistry, but nevertheless, that's what they lead with. They say, well, we've got the scientific method and we can determine truth, what truth is. All other systems of truth are excluded from these people, including biblical Christianity, including the whole field of philosophy, which even outside of, like Christianity and other religion, philosophy has been around forever. Well, they don't like any of that stuff because it's competition. If you cannot prove it scientifically, they simply do not recognize it as being true. So it's kind of them against the world at this point. They have created and insulated themselves in their own groupthink, that the whole goal of their universe is to control all the resources of the world and thereby control all of society in the world and all the people within the society in the world. This is their master engineering campaign, where they can scientifically engineer everything that people do and all of society, which is the collective things that people do, to get them to do reasonable things that are reasonable in the technocrat's mind. This is really crazy. This might remind you, if you ever happen to watch the old cartoon, it's a Steven Spielberg creation, believe it or not, back in the 90s, called Pinky and the Brain. This was an amazing cartoon series, but every episode started out where the brain, of course, was a mouse that was a genius, he said. He thought he was a genius, and his insane sidekick, Pinky, would ask him the question every night. So what are we going to do tonight, Brain? And Brain would say, same thing we do every night, Pinky. We're going to try to take over the world. And then they'd go into some crazy scheme that they would, to do that, and they would get thwarted every time. But this is kind of the mentality of the technocrat mind today. They want to control everything that they can get their hands on to control. And they're looking at the whole world right now. The proof of that, by the way, is in the fact that who else would have the chutzpah to shut down the global economic system? This is not Democrat or Republican issue. This is not Marxist versus anybody else issue. There's no Marxists in the world that could shut down the global economic system, probably nor would they want to. But these technocrats who just don't care about the rest of the world, really, in terms of people, They had no problem doing that.
Tell me, in America, who are these technocrats? Give me some names that we would know.
We could sweep through the members of the Trilateral Commission for sure. That was one of the original elite groups that started this new international economic order back in the 1930s, or excuse me, back in the 1970s, early 70s. You had people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who recently passed. He was the main guy, and he happened to be a professor at Columbia University when he was caught the eye of David Rockefeller, the big money guy, who decided they would start the Trilateral Commission and start promoting this ideology of a new economic world system. And then, of course, you have people like David Rockefeller. You have people like heads of giant global corporations, like, well, let's take Jeff Bezos at Amazon, for instance. Let's take Elon Musk at Tesla and whatever other things, SpaceX and stuff he's involved in. You've got the CEO, most of the directors of a company like Siemens out of Germany. These people are all dedicated to this new international economic order. In America, by the way, it's now called, for us, it's being remarketed as the Green New Deal. And if anybody looked at the Green New Deal and shook their head and laughed, stop laughing, okay? This is serious business.
Well, the Green New Deal has been pretty much adopted at this point by the Democratic Party.
Oh, you're right. California, it has. I forgot about that. You're absolutely right. California, they bought it hook, line, and sinker.
Well, I think even Biden has made some pretty favorable comments about.
Oh, yes, he has. He's totally into it.
Yeah.
At this
so
point.
Let me go back to these couple names that you mentioned, because this is important. So you mentioned Jeff Bezos, and you mentioned Elon Musk.
Yes.
I want to talk about each one of them individually, but let's start with Musk, because Musk is the one who actually was speaking out, as I recall, against some of these shutdowns. He was kind of a fan of. Many people became a fan of his based on some of the comments that he made. So why are you throwing Musk into the group?
Elon Musk, this is my opinion, but I'll tell you the rest of the story in a second. Elon Musk was concerned about his own plants, not about you and me. It's not that he cares about whether we're locked down or whether we're, economically prosperous, but most of his activities, economic activities, based in California. And they tagged him really hard.
They shut down his plant, and
oh my God.
he sued them over it.
Yes.
Yeah.
He did. He has no love lost for politicians. That's more indicative of how they felt back in the 30s, by the way, when the technocrats wanted to get rid of all the politicians, said they're idiots, they don't know what they're doing, and kind of like what we say today, and let's just get rid of them and just let technocracy run the whole thing. And so Musk would be fine as that. But let me tell you a little secret about Elon Musk that a lot of people don't know. Elon Musk was actually born and raised actually in South Africa, but his grandparents came from Canada. During the time when technocracy was a really big thing in Canada, every province had its own chapter of technocracy. It was very popular. There was one guy across the whole country that was the grand poobah, so to speak, of the whole technocracy movement in Canada. And they were dedicated to this whole idea of everything we're talking about here. The head poobah was Elon Musk's grandfather. His name was Joshua Haldeman. This is the home that Musk grew up in that was steeped in technocracy. And he shows all of the symptoms, the mental symptoms, if you will, of the good technocrats, even going back to the 1930s. And Haldeman eventually got tired of Canada, and he decided to move. He moved to South Africa, where Musk grew up. And then Musk came back to Canada, went to school, then to the United States to went more school, and then he resided in the United States after that. But looking at Musk and his activities today and realizing his upbringing and his family connections to historic technocracy is very revealing. Nobody could look at Elon Musk and ever call him a Marxist. He is the farthest thing from a Marxist that you can imagine. He's not a communist, and he's not a socialist. that makes sense.
And how would you explain or connect his fascination with going to Mars, living on Mars, colonizing Mars with being a technocrat?
This has been a dream going back well into the last century. I think even back to maybe about the very early 1900, 1910, that man would one day escape planet Earth and go to the stars. That's shared by a lot of people, not just Musk. Jeff Bezos has his own plan. Virgin Airways in Great Britain has its own plan to go to space and to go to Mars. So this has been realized when you get enough money in your pocket, like Musk has and like Bezos has at this point, they can play on the side with their pet dreams. And that's been a pet dream for decades and decades, to get out of the atmosphere and get on to other planets. And it's interesting. I knew a guy, scratched my head over this guy. He was kind of a friend. I'm part of a networking group with him. This was probably 15 years ago, before Elon Musk came on the scene. And he was into everything Mars. I mean, he had this website that he followed, had everything about Mars that you could imagine, every little bit of information that come out, that would get on this website. He was all excited about Mars and he said, one day we're going to Mars. I always scratched my head at this guy. I never quite understood why are you so fascinated with Mars? And never really got a straight answer from him either. He says, I just think it's the coolest thing in the world. We should go to Mars one day. And anyway, this is a goal.
Isn't it's part of a mentality, isn't it, that we are somewhat doomed here on Earth? That we're going to cause our own extinction because we're such horrible stewards of the Earth, and that's why we need a planet. And that fits right in with the technocrats.
That's what they say. That's exactly what they say.
And do technocrats believe that the Earth has become overcrowded?
Generally speaking, the United Nations has promoted the idea of overpopulation, as you probably know, for well over 50 years. It was the Club of Rome originally that came out with a little booklet called Limits to Growth. This was back before 1973. I think it was 1968 they came out with this. And this, the Club of Rome grew out of an association with the Rockefeller family in Italy. And they proposed that the Earth was going to be vastly overpopulated at some point, that the resources could not conceivably support the population that's coming. And so they determined even back then there's only two things that can happen. Either we increase the resources, which they said was impossible, or we decrease the population, thereby decreasing the drain on the resources of the world. And this is still the mentality today. Population control is very much a big theme with sustainable development. They have written a lot of things about population control over the last 25, 30 years.
I've never quite understood when I'd say half of my friends, if you asked them, is the world overcrowded or the U.S. overcrowded, then they would say yes, and half would say no. The people who say yes to that, what does that tell us about them and their way of thinking, et cetera? Because it makes zero sense to me. If you fly over the Western United States, it's just vast emptiness. Yes. And Las Vegas and Phoenix proves that you can build a very nice city in the middle of vast emptiness and be just fine. So the idea that the Earth is overcrowded, or even that the United States of America is overcrowded, just makes zero sense to me.
It does make zero sense, and you have to just believe the lie like a religious proposition to buy into it. There was a doctor, professor by the name of Paul Ehrlich in around 1970, who wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And he made wild predictions that population was going to be so bad that we'd be standing elbow to elbow in some sections of the world, and that the world would eventually just consume itself and mankind could even be extinguished because of the overpopulation. Well, here's the deal with Paul Ehrlich. His book sold millions of copies. It was translated into almost every popular language in the world. it sold tens of millions of copies. And so it populated the world, inoculated the world with this idea. But since then, since the 1970 to today, not one single prediction that Paul Ehrlich ever made in his book has come true. Not even close. Now, you would think that just based on that, people would throw the book in the trash. And you think they would say, look, Ehrlich is a nut. And you know what? Ehrlich made all these predictions based on his PhD science. He was an entomologist, a bug scientist. And he was applying what he knew about bugs, like, crickets and cockroaches or whatever, and how fast they breed, to humans. And he concluded, oh my gosh, we're going to overpopulate the world in probably 15 years. Never happened. All of his predictions fell apart. Nothing has come true that he has said. In fact, it's gone in the other direction. But that does not dissuade those who believe the world is overpopulated from saying it's overpopulated still. And it's not. It's just flat out not. But these people cannot open their eyes and see the vast resources. Heck, in California, all you need to do is drive up Highway 5 all the way through the state. There's vast expanse up there even.
Oh, yeah. I mean, most people have been to California, of course, but might not be familiar with it as you and I. What's stunning to me is you can drive along the coast of California, the California coast, one of the most coveted places in the world. And most of the California coast is empty.
Yes.
Wide open spaces within miles of the coast,
yes,
going all the way up and down. So this, you've been called a conspiracy theorist. This whole idea that there's this technocracy out there has been called a conspiracy. What do you say to these people?
I've had that criticism for 45 years. I'm used to it. None of it's true, but I'm used to it. And back in the late 1970s and early 80s, when my writing partner back then, Professor Anthony Sutton, and I were writing about the Trilateral Commission and the new international economic order, we made speaking engagements all over the country, did a lot of radio interviews as well. And we talked to a lot of America about what was going on with this new international economic order business. And those people who were involved in it finally decided they needed to do something about us. So what they did was they devised ways to sweep us either to the far right or the far left. And sometimes it was in both directions. And what they did is they left themselves in the center position. In other words, they were the reasonable people in the whole game here. And everybody else was just a fringe-oriented wingnut. And it didn't matter if you were a far leftist or a far rightist, as long as they remained in the middle, everything was good. And this is exactly the same thing they're doing today, probably on steroids now. But if you kind of watch the narrative of censorship today, you will see they always leave themselves in the reasonable center. They are the reasonable ones. You are the crazy person.
Right. Follow the science. Follow the science, they say.
Well, that's right. And it's not real. It's not really science. That's the problem. I know plenty of scientists and engineers in my life who are great people. They don't wake up every morning wanting to control the world. They just want to be physicists and mathematicians and chemists or whatever. They just want to apply their trade and do real science, which is based on the real scientific method. These pseudoscience come along, like Anthony Fauci, for instance. He says 1 month, nobody should wear a face mask. They don't work anyway. 6 weeks later, he says, everybody needs to wear a face mask because it's scientifically proven that it stops the coronavirus. Well, wait a minute. What? You said the science was settled 2 months ago, but now it's resettled today? No, See, this is pseudoscience. This is how pseudoscience behaves. It can flip-flop faster than somebody like Joe Biden can.
Well, it reminds me of, 1 year they say red meat is good for you, and the next year it's bad for you, and then it goes back and forth between being good and bad. And those are from scientists. So this whole idea that listen to the scientists, well, they tell you something different every year. and including your example of the mask.
Exactly. And in Europe, I just got to bring this up. We're talking about food. In Europe today, the big thing with the United Nations, they're pushing insect protein. Insect protein. Maybe they consulted Paul Ehrlich on that. I don't know. But there are actually cricket farmers in Europe raising crickets to bake them or dry them. They get dye, obviously, and then grind them into powder, which they consider is very rich in protein, and selling the protein powder from crickets as a source of protein to use in shakes and drinks and other concoctions that will keep you alive, they say, and may even get rid of the need for red meat one day and stuff. I'm sorry.
So then we can get rid of cows and flatulence and...
That's right. I'm not eating crickets in my protein shake. Thank you very much.
So how do you explain, you did a good job of explaining, because I've been wondering this myself, how it was that so many countries, virtually every country, fell in line with this idea of shutting down their economy to fight COVID. It's one of these things where kind of like, it never made sense to me, but I thought I got to be missing something because everybody's making the same decision. So it must be me. I must not be quite understanding this, but Sweden didn't do it. What is your explanation as to why Sweden didn't do it?
Sweden is very tightly connected with sustainable development. This does make it a little bit strange, but the health director in Sweden was really the primary one that says we're not going to use our people as guinea pigs. That was her mentality. She cared more about the people than she did about what the United Nations wanted to tell them what to do. But Sweden was an outlier. Now, don't forget that. They were an outlier, but they proved the point. They did very well, having done nothing. It just, okay, we had a good old flu season. A lot of people got sick. Some died, got back to normal, didn't have to kill our economy in the process. I don't think the United Nations was very happy with Sweden for having taken that position. But in order to understand how the whole world will move in lockstep, you have to understand the treaty system with the United Nations. The United Nations has been busy for decades making treaties with individual countries. And you might say, well, what gives them the right to make a treaty with anybody? It has been, in a sense, it's been voluntary. Those countries came to the water trough and they were convinced that that was the thing they should all jointly agree to do. So they did that. The United Nations would take that bulk treaty where everybody had signed on, and they would then hold on to that treaty, and there's been dozens of them over the years. And many of them had to do with the World Health Organization, which is part of the United Nations. And then when there was something that the United Nations wanted everybody to do at the same time, they would use those treaties. In other words, the UN lawyers would go out and say, you remember, you signed these treaties, right? This is what you must do. Paragraph 86, subsection, whatever, C, you have to do this. And the countries go, gee, we did, and this is international law, and we did sign it, so I guess we have to do it. This is exactly what happened with the pandemic. Those treaties were already in place. The United Nations says, if you don't participate, if you don't do what we tell you to do, you are going to be in big trouble. And most of them just rolled over and said, yes, we'll do it.
And to be clear, what was specifically the directive of the UN as it pertains to COVID?
The same thing that came out of the Imperial College of London. The same thing.
And was it actually orders of lockdown?
Well, they couched everything in terms of guidelines, didn't they? Guideline is not law. Guideline is not even a regulation. But when the World Health Organization puts out a directive, it's to be treated as gospel truth by the signatories to the treaties that they sign.
How do you explain somebody like Governor DeSantis in Florida who held out on lockdown and then eventually caved?
Well, yeah, he eventually caved. I can't say it's anything other than political pressure.
Mm-hmm.
whether it came from Washington or whether it came directly from other governors, whether, like the the National Governors Association was horribly bought into this whole COVID thing, and the National Association of Governors is not it's not a federal thing at all. It's a nonprofit organization that is completely
led by Cuomo and Hogan out of Maryland. The Republican is Hogan, right, and the Democrat is Cuomo.
That's right, exactly.
But there are a handful of states that stuck to their guns. I think South Dakota, yes. Maybe a couple others, right, that did not lock down.
Yes.
So
That's
my
right.
explanation for the reason that everybody locked down, or particularly in America, is a few things. I mean, Democrat governors were obviously far more inclined to have tougher lockdowns. That Democrats in general, the ideology is more paternalistic. So they have no problem with the idea of saying that we're going to protect your health. It's the Bloomberg, don't drink a soda that's more than 16 ounces because it's bad for you. Two, that politicians are generally risk adverse. They don't want someone to point to them and say that all these deaths happened on your watch. Mm-hmm. And then the third is kind of the anti-Trump element of it, that, we finally got him. The economy was going great. Now we can say the economy is not going great because of COVID and how you screwed up COVID. So that's always been my explanation, the kind of those three reasons as to why we did the lockdown. Do you agree with that? Or are you saying, no, Jim, you're really missing it? It's technocracy.
No, I'll just tell you the way that I look at it. When, let's say you're driving down a street and you're following behind a Brinks car that carries all the cash. And all of a sudden, unbeknownst to the driver, the back doors fly open and cash starts littering the street in big bundles. And the driver doesn't even see it. He's doing something else. He just drives on down the road and you see all this cash laying around. What are you going to do? What's everybody else going to do? The whole freeway is going to stop, or the whole street's going to stop, and people are going to run out in a pack and grab as much cash as they possibly can. When money's flying, it's my point here, when money is flying around because of stimulus, because of some other political advantage that they can discover, that they can find, there's a feeding frenzy that takes place that I compare much to a trout farm, where when you throw the pellets of feed out into the water, the little fish chum, and they all come up to the water, to the top, like this, in a big wave at the same time, and gobble up all the food. This has been a chumming operation for all these governors and mayors and county commissioners and so on across the country to get theirs, to feather their own nest. For instance, in Arizona, we have a Republican governor. He's supposed to be a conservative. Well, that's for another story. But he has maintained our lockdown here in Arizona. And even now, when our death count is very low, he is not intending to release it to let everybody open up again. He has made decisions to allow certain businesses to go out of business and other businesses to survive. He's making those kinds of decisions for our economy. He has his own hands deep into financial investments that are directly benefited by his lockdown. It's conflict of interest. And yet, people here in Arizona get so mad at him, they could just spit molten lead, but can't do anything about it because he's the governor and he's executed these executive orders, and he's just getting away with literally pillaging our state. This is happening all over America. And these other tin horn wannabe tyrants finally had an opportunity to express themselves, as they always wanted to do, but were limited by the political system and the rule of law. Now anything goes. And all those downline people, they're all just going nuts with their own little agendas. And some people suggest, well, it's all about going to get Trump. Is it being used for that? Sure it is. That's just one of the sub-political games that's being played. If they can use anything to pummel Trump, they will.
Last two questions. So the technocrats are happy to see what is going on.
Oh, yes.
In the response to COVID because
it deconstructs society. You have probably been aware of the move over the last 3 or 4 decades to decentralize government, to push things back out to the states. I
like that.
If it were possible, I do too, honestly. I'm not just saying. But it's not necessarily to restore where the Constitution would have us be restored, but is to decentralize government so that elements of society can be more easily run by algorithm rather than being run by the political system. And that's the goal of technocracy. So when you see BLM and Antifa rioting in cities like Portland and, well, LA is another good one, they're not the main act here. They are a deconstructive element to society to tear it apart. And it will take capitalism and free enterprise down with it if it could, because they're now chanting, at least in Portland, death to America, death to America. Well, that sounds pretty direct to me. But they will be sad to find out when, as and if the technocrats of the world take over, they will be among the first that get thrown under the bus and simply eliminated from society. They don't know that now. They think they really got, the power here. They don't have the power other than what's being allowed for them to have.
So that was going to be my last question, was connecting Black Lives Matter movement to all of this. And the belief on the right is that this is a revolutionary movement to implement socialism. So is there a technocratic element to this Black Lives Matter movement? It sounds like you're saying no.
I think that there probably is some funding that is going on that's coming from sources more associated with the technocrat movement than with anything else. This will come out, I think, in time. Some people have suggested that there are some very wealthy individuals in the world that are, bent towards technocracy, but also bent towards destroying our society. And I won't mention any names, no need to. But BLM and Antifa are not funded by crumbs that fall into the street. Anybody would know that that's got 2 brain cells. These people are getting bucketfuls of money from somewhere that's outside of their ability to get any money. Most of these kids and people are bums. They have no jobs. They have no source of income. They have no skills other than throwing bricks through windows. Where do they come from, and who pays them to keep going? Who feeds them? Who gives them shelter?
Well, I have to ask you about one name that you always hear, and that's George Soros. Is he, in your view, I think it's, if you just go to Wikipedia, it's acknowledged on Wikipedia that he's given to these organizations. So it's not a conspiracy theory that he's given to them. He has given to them. But is he a technocrat or not?
He is supporting everything that technocracy wants to do. He's totally for sustainable development. He's totally for the deconstruction and ripping apart of society. And even though he's not a direct member of some of the global elite organizations, he is incredibly influential in others, like the World Economic Forum, for instance, which is pledged to this concept of the Great Reset, to reset the global economic system into sustainable development. That's the founder of the WEF, Klaus Schwab, has written about this extensively, by the way.
And what about the breakup of the nuclear family that BLM supports and Marxist supports? Is that also one of the goals of technocrats?
It absolutely is. Do you remember the book Brave New World?
Yeah.
1932, it was written the same year that Columbia University housed the technocracy movement. 1932, it was written by a Brit by the name of Aldous Huxley, who was hobnobbing with the president of Columbia, Nicholas Murray Butler. They called him Miraculous Nicholas because he was hobnobbing all over Europe all the time. And Brave New World was written looking into the face of technocracy. Now, if you Read that book and you see there is no family unit. There's no such thing as mothers and fathers. All the children are born in a test tube. There is no such thing as getting married because everybody has equal opportunity to sleep and to be with everybody else. No nuclear family whatsoever. This has been an idea that's been around for a long time, and it was more adopted into the circles of technocracy than any other philosophy of that day.
And why is that something that they support? How does that meet their ends?
Because it allows for the total management of society, management and control of all of society and all the people in it. They want to manage all the people in society. That's why they have to monitor and surveil whatever to know what people are doing. That's also why they need to drill down and find out, build a DNA database so they can figure out what your genetic makeup is. And this kind of dates back to the eugenics movement too, by the way. But they want micromanagement control over individual people. And people living in family units cannot be controlled as easily because they have loyalties to each other, not loyalties to the government or to the state.
Thank you again to our guest, Patrick Wood. You can check out his books on Amazon, and you can also check out his website, Citizens for Free Speech. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker, and to our intern, Jake Wall. We'll be back soon with another episode of The Hidden Truth Show. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.